I'll keep this for good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. This is a meeting that truly begins with the story of an encounter, and that's what we'll be doing this evening. First of all, I'd like to thank those who invited us, those who organized everything. I think Don Julián Carrón, who is here with us. And we are truly here to, I really hope, that each of us takes home tonight what I think has happened to anyone who has read this book. That is truly a spark of hope, because that's what this is about. And I was saying this earlier at dinner. The first thing that struck me about this book is the feeling of being inside an encounter. It is a book with 3 voices, but as you can already tell, it originates from an earlier story, a meaningful story, a story that carries significance. An encounter that actually began almost 10 years ago and brings together 3 important voices: a Canadian, a Welshman, and a Spaniard from the far, harsh region, in a place where the cherry blossoms in bloom say more than many words. And precisely because this aspect is already so significant, I would briefly hand the floor over to Professor Geraldine, who is, from many points of view, the driving force behind this book, but also behind this experience, to tell us a bit about how it all began. Please, go ahead.
Good evening. More than as Professor Geraldine, this book actually began as Alessandra, because we were in Cambridge, studying with a group of friends. I pursued a doctoral program at the University of Cambridge, and we happened to have this remarkable encounter with a group of Anglican professors and students who had created a real movement within the Anglican Church. Let's say, even though it was a movement very much connected to the university, it placed a great deal of emphasis on human relationships. In fact, after a very short time, one of the leaders of this movement, Professor John Milbank, a theologian and philosopher, introduced us to Rowan Williams, who was then the primate of the Anglican Church. We felt like little dwarfs compared to him, not only because of his position, but because he is truly an incredibly intelligent and cultured person, speaks many languages. And what amazed us most was his openness of heart. It was clear how this man was constantly searching for something truly meaningful in his life, not just once and for all, but day by day. And so through this Anglican professor, our relationship was established between Rowan Williams and Julián Carrón, which then developed in a completely independent way. And this was already happening before 2010, around 2010. Then there was this other major meeting with Professor Charles Taylor, because we were always with this group of friends for study reasons, let's say, attending a lecture by Professor Taylor in Rome. And then I was going to stay in Rome for an audience with Pope Francis. Professor Taylor is one of the greatest philosophers, an outstanding scholar of the phenomenon of secularization. This hefty book he wrote, nearly 1,000 pages long, translated into Italian as A Secular Age, won the Templeton Prize, a very, very important international award. And there was always this group of Anglican friends as well, including Rowan Williams and John Milbank. And at a certain point, Professor Taylor asked if he could stay for this audience. except that the next day he was supposed to leave for Canada. So I told him that, unfortunately, there was no way, it was impossible to change the ticket. But he said, no, I want to come, help me change the ticket. And so, because of this chance encounter, he completely changed his plans. And from there, an intense dialogue began with him precisely on the phenomenon of secularization. And once, when he later returned to Rome to receive the Ratzinger Prize for Philosophy and Theology from Pope Francis, there was the opportunity for this dinner with Julián Carrón. And the two of them, who come from very different backgrounds and have very different sensibilities, really became animated, let's say fired up, on this heated topic, that is secularization. In other words, in our time, so how it represents a tremendous opportunity to discover our needs, to understand what our true needs are, the ones that keep us alive, that make us get up every morning, and what can respond to these needs. So together they had a lively discussion about the nature of Christianity as a possible answer, but also as a continual reawakening of the fundamental needs and desires of human beings. Therefore, this book did not come from an intellectual project, absolutely not, but rather it gathers a piece of history and meaningful friendship among these three men.
I would start right away with the title, which I believe is a title that does everyone good, Inhabiting Our Time, which is truly a prophetic expression. From a giant of our era, Francis, from November 8th, 2023, a general audience. Today, as I was thinking about what we would discuss this evening, I started a bit from my own experience, which I will share with you tonight. I'm a teacher, so I am in a place, the school, not where, by definition, it seems like everything is always rushed. Everything is changing. We live in a time when it really does seem like everything is unstable, where you can't find meaning. And school is one of the places where these fears are projected even more. These young people wondering what will become of our future. Reading a title like this, Inhabiting Our Time, not just being in our time, but inhabiting it in the sense of giving meaning to what we all do in our daily lives, in our places, at work, in the family. That is really trying to pause for a moment and recreate a sense of purpose. And even this challenge, living without fear in the age of uncertainty. I believe that this alone is truly a perspective, a point of view, a way of positioning oneself at an angle to the spirit of the times. And that is exactly what these three voices courageously do. The first issue that is brought to the table is precisely this. We are living in a time without certainties. Taylor says, first of all, it seems important to me to note that we no longer live in Christendom. But I also believe that this new situation will push Christians to take a step forward beyond the admirable achievements reached by Christendom. Julián Carrón says, we are living in a time when certainties have collapsed. That is first and foremost the courage to address the issues that we often push aside, that we feel working beneath the surface in our daily lives, creating uncertainty and anxiety, but which we are not truly able to look at with clarity. So this is the first point I would like to suggest to you. What does it mean today to face a time without certainties?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this invitation and this opportunity. For this opportunity to have a dialogue about topics that concern all of us, right? Because the concept of the chronicle of the evident might seem like something abstract, right? Instead, we see it so many times in everyday life, at every level. For example, the difficulty children have in understanding certain things we tell them. The difficulty in connecting with students. the difficulty in understanding colleagues at work and sometimes even the difficulty in understanding between husband and wife. Why? Because it seems that things we used to share, we no longer share. Right? And the first thing is to understand this. But why? What happened? Why do we almost unconsciously find ourselves facing this difficulty, this lack of harmony over things that previously seemed the most obvious? Because if we don't understand this, we struggle to grasp what our time really means. And then we find ourselves having difficulty relating to. We'll see that we can give some very concrete examples, always delving deeper into the different topics. But it seems to me that, for me, what was very helpful in understanding this was to give a brief historical overview. Reading Pope Benedict XVIII, when he describes what happened historically after the Protestant Reformation, the subsequent religious wars among Christians, it means that unity blew apart, it had blown apart. And what had previously constituted common ground at a certain point became fragmented. And so at a certain point, when Christians of different denominations, we could say, got tired of arguing, we had to rebuild something, in order to live together. If religion was no longer what we had in common, what did we have in common? Reason. And so Kant, a prominent figure in this awareness, says, let's create a religion within the limits of reason, which is an attempt to separate those fundamental values that Christianity has, broad values we all share because of our Christian background, but leave out all the denominational ties and seek for what we share together, a foundation that can endure beyond our disputes. When the Enlightenment thinkers conceived of this, they believed it could last, but time has shown us, as we see today, that these values brought by the Christian tradition, family life, the individual freedom, all these great issues and gifts are in fact now beginning to be emptied of their meaning, even though they were supported for centuries by laws, by the convictions of nations, by being upheld in so many ways by traditional mindsets. At a certain point, it's as if they lost their obviousness. And so suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where the most obvious issues, or at least those that seemed most obvious some time ago, are no longer obvious. What we mean by this expression, the collapse of things that were once obvious, is precisely what defines our era. And more, as Pope Francis has said, we are not just living in a time of change, but in a change of era. Right? The further we go, the more this difference becomes apparent. So, understanding the origin of this, because it's not as if everything changed overnight, it's been a process, as if the meaning of certain words has gradually been emptied out, so that now they mean something different to people. We struggle to communicate with others even about the most basic issues. And so understanding this helps us grasp a distinctive feature of our time. I went to present this book in Battipaglia in southern Italy. I never would have imagined that in a town near Salerno, you could encounter such a great religious and cultural diversity as I found there, as if it were New York or London or Hong Kong. Why is that? Because the world is completely different now.
Yes, I would add a problematic element, something I reflected on a lot when I read the first part, precisely this initial point you raised. We clearly are all part of a generation that lives on a clear fault line. Most of us have actually experienced a world that was essentially that of the 20th century, in which, for many of us, cultural upbringing was absolutely Christian. And yet again, thinking about what I see during my mornings at school, this year, for example, our fifth-year students will have been born in 2007. And this question that is being asked, then this strong realization that comes at the beginning of the book, Taylor says we no longer live in Christendom. In reality, for the kids I see, the 16 and 17-year-olds, it is an absolute fact. Whereas I realized that when I was in high school in the 1990s, the world was radically different. We all understand that this is a fault line. Communication has changed, the way we exist in the world has changed, and the way we actually construct and try to make sense of our answers has changed. But I have to say, this very awareness, this consciousness of just how much this period is truly a time of crisis opens up, I would say, in a beautiful way, really full of hope to the very next step that you take in this book. And the point is this: a crisis forces us to return to the questions. And at a certain point you say, Taylor says, we need to look to the figure of Christ. Christ is that figure who, at a certain point in the midst of the storm, remains calm. That is in the moment of crisis, when it truly seems like we are losing all our points of reference, and when the world we once knew, the one in which we had rooted all our certainties, seems to be falling apart. Young people today are telling us this, that questions are becoming important again. In your opinion, what are the questions that truly need to be brought back home, to be refocused, that we all need to ask ourselves again, even those of us who have already completed much of our life's journey?
We constantly take these questions in the many signs we encounter in everyday life. You just referred to the context in which Jesus begins to enter into human history. We look back and Jesus enters a world where there was an enormous religious diversity. Sadducees, Essenes, high priests, Baptists, Essenes. And Jesus stands before this diversity by saying a word that the Pope used. Disarmed, he gives up his power and stands before everyone with this remarkable courage. And then Christianity goes out into the Hellenistic world, a very diverse world where all religions are present, the pantheon. Let us remember that pantheon of the gods, where there is a diversity of religious forms. Christianity has always existed in a very different cultural context, hasn't it? People searching for meaning. This then changes with the arrival of Constantine, and especially Theodosius, which lasted almost until the time of the Enlightenment and then into our own era. So we find ourselves in a world that we can say is very similar to the one in which Christianity began. And Jesus enters that world, as you say, which is in turmoil. They are like sheep without a shepherd, each one groping for a meaning to life, putting forward a way of being in reality that could contribute to the possibility of finding an answer to this search. What are the questions that people have? The meaning of life, the reason. to get up in the morning, the meaning of suffering. But what good is it to gain the whole world if one loses oneself? Because, people have repeated this in every possible way, right? Why? Because anyone who experiences life cannot help but realize, as Leopardi said, that everything is small, insignificant compared to the soul's capacity, because this dissatisfaction keeps coming back in so many ways. But I ask, is there something that lasts? Is there something that can truly answer the desire for fulfillment that we humans carry within us? Or do we have to just settle for the fact that there is no answer? As Marrakesh says, I feel my time with it, my activities, but I can't feel the emptiness. This is the big question. Does everything we feel as a desire for fulfillment have any chance of finding an answer or not? The difference from the past is that today Christianity is not, as it was in the past, let's say, the only proposal we are faced with. That cultural unity has blown apart, and now we find ourselves with the Christian proposal being just one of many possibilities, as it was in the Roman Empire or in the time of first century Palestine. So we find ourselves groping in the dark with our questions, but there isn't, let's say, any unanimity in proposing possible answers. We are faced with this diversity in this change of era. And each person is called upon. This is the exciting aspect of this moment from my point of view, because now everyone has to get involved, as Taylor says, in the search for an answer. Taylor defines our time as an age of seekers of reason to live, and this is what we share. It means that the questions have not disappeared with secularization. Many times they are even more acute. They have grown. Why? Because whether religious or not, the questions that press upon life continue to persist because of their urgency. So this is the key. This is the fundamental characteristic of our time. We can no longer simply, as the image goes, step onto a conveyor belt that carries us along. No, there is no conveyor belt. In other words, there is nothing that makes it easier for us. We are all a bit lost, searching for something that gives flavor, meaning, and fullness to life. And often, even if we manage to achieve our goals, whether they are family-related, social, or career-oriented, it is not enough. And there are many signs. One that struck me, just to mention one that we all know, is when a couple of years ago, the song that won the Oscar was about the question, why were we made? Because seeing that just surviving wasn't enough, the girl who sings asks, but why was I made? And when she sees that nothing, not even having fun, fulfills her, she asks again, but why was I made? And when Marrakesh, after having gotten out, as he said in a recent interview about his poverty, about where he was born, and after being able to earn money and achieve success, he says, guys, I would give you a Rolex so that you could understand that even this wouldn't be enough to make you wake up joyful tomorrow morning. That's why now what matters to me is understanding, but who am I? What do I want? He went from trying to find success as an answer to asking himself, but why? Even though I achieved this success, did I find myself facing an unnatural silence and emptiness? But who am I? He shifted from seeking in fulfillment in success to realizing that this isn't enough. Who am I? Why is it that even when I have this success, I still can't fill the emptiness? These are the questions in so many forms that keep pressing in on our lives.
In fact, the most human and humanizing experience that comes through in this dialogue is above all this one, that it is a great service to all of us, right? Putting my fear, your fear, our fear back at the center, which this week made me reflect a bit by chance. In class, I brought Manzoni's Pentecost, the sacred hymn, and there's that whole initial church, right? Before the outpouring of the Spirit, which is hidden, which has the doubt of failure, the time of Holy Saturday, the time of the disciples of Emmaus who return defeated. So looking also at that possible dimension of faith, of our presence in history. And above all, then offering a new perspective of meaning, but also having the courage to understand what the negative attitude might be. Because rightly, at a certain point, this reflection is made. Crisis is also the moment when divisions become strong. And we have talked about it in every setting, on every possible occasion. We realize how today is a polarized time. We are divided. We are quarrelsome with one another. We put up barriers, and this actually happens even among those who live. By the Christian message, the fear of diversity, we retreat into defending what seems to us a heritage that must not be lost, but at the expense of others. At a certain point, Taylor says, Christians often feel themselves at the boundary between two types of communities, two types of relationships. But there is also an entire church that, however, opens up. And so, before I get to the important and beautiful part, I would also like to say a few words about this closing in on ourselves, about this feeling of being under siege, and how, in fact, it really makes it hard to breathe.
But this really raises a big question, doesn't it? Because if someone who feels under siege might simply see it as a problem. And what if this were the chance to realize, but what reason do I have? I met a student at school who, for various reasons he actually told me about, also felt under siege, right? Because someone had talked to him about demons, and for anything that he felt wasn't working, he blamed the demons. And so he said he felt this anxiety weighing on him. So the principal brought him to me and said, "Can you talk to him?" I said, "But what is it that you want?" "I want the truth. Because they make me feel this anxiety, all these issues. I want to get out of this situation, you know?" I said, "But in your opinion, what is it or that makes you so fragile?" "Well, I end up feeling like I just can't handle it. I need to get out of this. I want to know the truth because only this," she had sensed that only this could free her from this anxious situation. Because one of her brothers had these panic attacks. I said, "Do you see? You feel like you're under siege," to give a concrete example of real people, right? Because deep down, you don't know who you are. If you don't become aware of yourself, you'll always be at the mercy of what others tell you. Many times, others point out or highlight personal problems we haven't faced in our lives, our lack of substance. And what if all of this were an opportunity to get to the bottom of that, to lay a foundation for life that allows us not to feel the external situation as a siege? Because Jesus enters into history and does not feel besieged. Many Christians live in history and do not feel besieged. We can live with a sense of certainty, can't we? If we can follow a path that gives us such a self-awareness that we don't just see ourselves as frightened, scared, like Jesus said earlier in front of the storm, right? When Jesus wakes up and sees his disciples frightened, full of fear, he says, "But do you still have no faith? Why do you doubt? Why is it that I stand before this storm and do not have this fear?" Christianity entered into history in order to respond to this situation. But this is only possible if one has an experience that can generate within him a person capable of living in reality without being determined by this fear, by this uncertainty, which the book talks about, right?
Yes.
And so one does not feel under siege, because this feeling of being under siege is what then leads to rigidity with others, to feeling that I cannot go along with the other, to seeing them as an enemy, to seeing them only as an obstacle, to feeling that everything is against me. But this is only a symptom of my own fragility. It is not others who create this fragility. They just bring it to light. And so, for us, as Pope Francis said during his visit to Canada, what if this were the opportunity to embark on a journey that makes us not more belligerent, but rather more capable of having such a certainty in what we live, that we can share this certainty with others in different contexts. A certainty that comes from a mature life experience that each person must discover where to find for themselves. Because when you meet someone like that, I too would like to be that free in a situation like the one we are living through. And if this were the opportunity to begin a journey like this young man, I want that. When he suggests this, to take this path, I want to follow it, because I want to discover that it is possible to live life without being ruled by anxiety.
Yes, both the perception of this and also the fact that it is one of the key points of the book. How truly in this paradigm shift there is, at a very fundamental level, in both a personal revolution and in reality a revolution that then becomes global, because we'll get to that, getting out of this fear. You say, I have never perceived reality or people as enemies, or Taylor says, we live in the paradox where I feel that in relationships with people who are driven by a path very different from my own, I am actually helped to move forward along the path that I recognize as mine. And so, when it comes to themes like ecumenism, forgiveness, and world peace, we understand that there are aspects that today resonate in a dramatic but also powerful way. However, the first revolution happens within ourselves. In fact, as you just said, embracing this perspective opens up the possibility for us to move forward, precisely because we are living in a secular age. And this struck me deeply, because it's something I've noticed in myself as well, but I believe it's an experience shared by many, when at a certain point it is said, stop believing that not believing, that being a non-believer, precludes the possibility of fulfillment as believers think, or that believing is just a system to explain what we experience, as atheists claim. That is, to give up this judgment about the other and to stop thinking that maybe a non-believer or someone who follows a path different from ours cannot have an experience of fulfillment. And on the other hand, to let go of the idea that just because someone embraces a greater path, that of faith, they have the presumption to understand everything they experience. In other words, to truly step out of a comfort zone that is shared by all.
But in my opinion, this is one of the big questions, isn't it? Because everyone, not just the non-believer, but also the believer, has to test in life the ability that the experience they live, whether as a believer or non-believer, has to face the drama of living. Because isn't it often the case that due to believing in a certain way, living out faith in a certain way, people end up living in fear and see the world as an enemy, and they see and want to defend themselves from this evil world by retreating into a bubble, right? We see how many Christians, in a certain way of living out their faith, perceive it as a risk and want to shut themselves away inside a world that no longer exists, which ends up not only failing to solve the problem, but actually making them even weaker. I always remember a story told by Don Burgio, who is a priest working with the young people at Beccaria, the juvenile detention center in Milan. He recounted an episode that happened to him. Sometimes a boy who had attended another community before coming to his would say, I used to live in that community where everything was surrounded by protections, and I was doing great there because I couldn't. Even the temptation to deal drugs wasn't there because there was no opportunity. I didn't even have to ask myself any questions because there was no risk. The problem came when, in order to allow him to take a step toward freedom, he left that place and ended up even weaker than before. Because so often we think that if we take refuge, right, in a comfort zone, right, or we want to shut our children away. In this situation, thinking that this way we're helping to protect them, but in reality, we're making them even weaker. If we don't offer them something that allows them to live in reality, if we don't create, if any ecclesial, educational, or formative environment, any place for personal growth, fails to produce people who can live in this real world, just as we are describing our times, things will only get worse. Because it means our inability to communicate to the new generation a sense of living and adequate reasons for it, and to help them follow a path that allows them to have the strength to remain in this world without being shaped by all these circumstances we are talking about. And this is the great social and cultural challenge we are facing. If our society, regardless of the way people live, in one way or another, is able to produce individuals with such strength, with such a powerful self-awareness, that they are able not to be overwhelmed by the reaction to evil, to injustice, or simply to someone else's opinion. Because how can we build bridges instead of walls if we are the first ones who are afraid? We will build walls instead of bridges. And how can we try to open ourselves to others and not remain in our own bubble? If we can breathe in the fresh air of the world, if we can go out into reality with the awareness that our worth is not about being more or less, but that the strength of a person, as Don Giussani used to say, lies in the intensity of their self-awareness. If we don't raise people like this, no matter what kind of education, what kind of choice of life, the situation will only get worse. That's why I say this is truly an urgent situation from an educational point of view, from the point of view of what parents need in order to raise children for this world. What is the challenge that schools face in order to raise people who we don't know where they'll end up working, whether it's in Madagascar, Kuala Lumpur, or Australia? In other words, if we don't raise people for this reality, it's a complete admission of failure. But I actually think that it's precisely in this situation, right? And when the Christian proposal is presented in such a way that it appeals to both reason and freedom, so that the person can put it to the test, it can offer an opportunity that I don't know how many other realities are able to provide. But this means that we have to ask ourselves why Jesus entered into history and was not afraid of his fate, of the situation, while we, Christians, almost seem to show the opposite, as if we are afraid in the face of this situation because something doesn't add up. Jesus not only wasn't afraid, but as St. Paul says, he stripped himself of his divine condition to enter into history as one among many. We, on the other hand, seem to think that this situation is too risky and we want to protect ourselves from it. So we each retreat into our own bubble, whatever that may be. But this means that there is something in the transmission of faith, in that experience that Christ placed in history, that is not able to generate people like that. What St. Paul calls a new creation. Because as soon as Christianity began to be communicated, it conveyed this newness in a world that was completely distant. Imagine when Christianity entered the great agora of the Roman Empire. There were just a handful of them. They were nothing. They had no influence on the centers of power. But never, as in that moment, was Christianity communicated more. But if Christianity today, I'm using Christianity as an example because any other proposal that claims to offer a solution will also have to verify it. It doesn't have it. So let it be said, whatever the proposal is, it's right. It's right if it's right. And we can see it. It produces people who are able to live in this society, as I say, and not further increase tensions, walls, opposition, rigidity, instead of creating a space for dialogue, for exchange, for reasons to stay and build something together. This is the challenge. We all face, whatever the scenario may be,